What's good, y'all? Were you in the building? And I was on DFran's live stream last night, and the conversation of Beyonce's Billboard chart history it came up, and it really made me ponder and think like, what would be the reason why it is the way it is?
You know what's crazy?
What?
I don't understand Beyonce's star power.
What do you mean?
Because like Beyonce is megastar, right?
Mm-hmm. Doesn't have an album in the Billboard 200.
But she doesn't have an album in the Billboard 200. Like
Jay-Z doesn't either.
Drake does, Kendrick does, even Future. Hell, Lil Baby's My Turn is Lil Baby. Think about this: the album that Cowboy Carter dropped after My Turn, right? But My Turn is still in the charts, and Cowboy Carter isn't. And Cowboy Carter has some big records on there. That just don't make sense. Unless I don't know, it just don't make sense to me. And I'm not saying she's not a star because she does stadium, so like that's solidified. But it's just weird that like none of her albums are on the top. It's just weird. Like I even say got to be like top 10. Just even like 140, 155, 160. Like it's just nothing.
It was just something that just wasn't right about Beyonce's Billboard history. It just didn't make sense to me. So this is an artist with 8 number one albums. 8. Dangerously in Love, B-Day, Sasha Fierce 4, Beyonce, Lemonade, Renaissance, and Cowboy Carter, like all number one albums. And yet, when you look at, the Billboard 200 today, you don't see the same kind of long-term album presence that you see from some of her peers even. There isn't a single Beyonce or Jay-Z album, for that matter, on the Billboard 200 currently. You know what I mean? And that's the part that nobody really wants to talk about. You know what I mean? And I honestly think Beyonce is incredibly good at creating an event around her music. Her rollout is usually 10 times out of 10. It's great. But is her music being consumed like an event after the first few weeks? Now, let's get one thing straight before anyone starts yelling in the comments or Beyonce's fans start going crazy, right? I'm not saying Beyonce is a flop. That would be ridiculous. Honestly, she's one of the biggest artists of all time. Again, Cowboy Carter alone did like 407,000 first week. So we're not talking about an artist who can't debut on the charts. We're talking about an artist whose albums can have, gigantic opening moments, but they don't necessarily have the same level of sustained daily and weekly consumption afterwards, as far as streaming goes, at the very least, let alone Billboard charting success, right? And that's a completely different conversation because Billboard tends to, it tends to reward what people are consuming right now, right? It takes all feelings out of it, right? Not what they loved 5 years ago, not what critics consider to be a classic, not how legendary an artist is, weekly and daily consumption. And that's where this whole Beyonce situation gets really interesting. So I had about 12 points or 12 reasons potentially why she hasn't really been doing as good as she used to be doing on the Billboard 200. And the first point is, I think Beyonce's biggest strength might also be her biggest Billboard weakness. Whenever Beyonce releases an album, it doesn't feel like, here's another album. It feels like Beyonce has arrived. There's anticipation, there's visuals, performance, fashion, interviews, touring, cultural conversation, whatever the case may be. Everything all happens at once. But here's the problem, if you ask me. I think an event is naturally going to be front loaded. You're obviously going to get a lot of attention concentrated around one moment, right? Your album is dropping, right? And you're Beyonce and your album is dropping, right? People listen because everybody's obviously talking about it, but then the conversation just gradually moves on. And if the music itself isn't generating constant individual single song consumption afterward, the album's weekly sales and the weekly units, they're going to fall off dramatically. Number 2, I think Beyonce doesn't operate like a Taylor Swift. Because, Taylor, she's built an entire ecosystem around her catalog. When Taylor releases something new, people don't just stream her album. They go back to her old albums. They go buy her physicals. They visit different editions of her album. They stream songs from previous albums. And I think Beyonce's whole strategy has historically been much more selective, and she's a lot more careful with how she rolls out her music, right? She doesn't constantly flood the market with new versions of every single album. She doesn't constantly remind the public like, look, hey, remember this album? Hey, stream this song. Here's another edition of this album. She doesn't do that. And I think that difference matters because in terms of Billboard, again, the conversation is Billboard 200, because Billboard how they rank their charting, it doesn't give you points for being mysterious. Billboard gives you points when people actually consume the music. And Taylor has become exceptionally good at, turning her entire catalog into an ongoing consumption machine daily. You know what I mean? Number three, I think Beyonce's long gaps matter because obviously Beyonce takes her time, right? And artistically, I kind of understand why. She isn't dropping an album every year just to stay relevant. Every time that Beyonce disappears for several years, her casual audience has more time to move on to somebody else. She just kind of disappears and then she returns. You know what I'm saying? And when she returns, she expects the music to kind of create the moment. And usually it does because it's Beyonce, right? But sustaining that moment is completely different. And it's a big challenge nowadays. It's not easy. Number four, I think Beyonce isn't constantly feeding the streaming economy. I think streaming kind of rewards consistency. It's not necessarily about artistic quality. It's not about legacy. It's not even about popularity in the traditional sense. It's about consistency. You know what I mean? And if an artist has, 10, 20, 30 songs that people routinely revisit, usually their catalog can remain relevant on the charts for, 10 weeks, 20 weeks, 30 weeks. It just depends, right? And the audience is going to keep consuming it. And Beyonce absolutely has huge songs. I'm never going to take away her impact and how big her songs are. But her catalog doesn't always operate from an endless streaming playlist for the general public. It's like it's a difference between I respect Beyonce, I love Beyonce, and I listen to Beyonce every day. I listen to Beyonce's album every day. Like I stream this album, I put this album in my playlist and stream it every single day. Those are three completely different things. And I think Billboard only cares about the third part of that. Especially when we're talking about weekly chart longevity, that's what Billboard really takes into account. Number five, I think Beyonce's catalog is not necessarily being discovered by younger listeners at the same rate. And here's obviously another uncomfortable truth that, a lot of legacy artists, they're going to have to come to grips with. Beyonce is a legacy artist. She's a legacy superstar now, and that means she has an enormous catalog. But having an enormous catalog doesn't automatically mean every generation is consuming every album equally, especially with the oversaturation of music in general. You know what I mean? Younger listeners, they might know a Crazy in Love. They might know a Single Ladies, a Cuff It, a Texas Hold'em, or a Formation. But knowing the biggest Beyonce songs isn't the same thing as sitting down and streaming an entire Beyonce album. Number six, Beyonce's albums aren't always built around the same kind of evergreen singles. Beyonce increasingly makes albums as a complete artistic body of work, and that's great for the album experience. But it can also create a problem if only one or two songs become permanent mainstream staples. Look at what happens with some of her peers, right? One song becomes a massive streaming staple, then another song catches fire, then a third song becomes a TikTok sound, then a fourth song gets revived years later. And then suddenly the album keeps generating consumption. And with Beyonce, sometimes the conversation is much more concentrated around the album as a project. Right? People experience it, they discuss it, and then they move on. And that distinction can be brutal on the Billboard 200. Very brutal. Number seven, I think Cowboy Carter. Cowboy Carter is actually the perfect example. I'm not going to say that the album was a failure necessarily. Far from it, obviously. But, it debuted number one. Again, 407,000 first week. It produced a massive number one hit with Texas Hold'em. I believe it won Album of the Year at the Grammys. So Beyonce eventually she took the album on a massive tour. It was great. One of the greatest years of her career, honestly. You know what I mean? So why wouldn't something like that translate into the kind of Billboard 200 longevity people might expect? Number eight, I think Beyonce's touring strategy can create a weird chart cycle. And there's another factor people overlook as well. The whole touring aspect, right? Because a tour can absolutely revive an album. Look what's going on with J. Cole, for his album. The Fall Off wasn't, and ironically, that's an ironic title, right? J. Cole's album, The Fall Off, obviously he's on tour and it's helping the numbers for The Fall Off. All the singles, all the streaming numbers are going up. When an artist tours, people suddenly hear the songs again. But Beyonce tends to concentrate her touring around major eras rather than constantly touring. And then once the tour ends, there isn't necessarily like another constant stream of promotional activity keeping the catalog in front of casual listeners. I think it's all about the casual listeners, right? Number 9, I think the Beyonce doesn't care about charts argument isn't the whole answer. Now, I already know what somebody's going to say. Beyonce doesn't care about charts, and maybe she doesn't, right? It's Beyonce, right? She's one of the most famous, most recognizable people in the whole world, right? It's Beyonce, right? And maybe she doesn't. Maybe she doesn't care about charts, but that's not really the question. The question is, why aren't her albums maintaining the same chart longevity as some of her peers? Whether Beyonce personally cares about that is irrelevant. Billboard is still measuring something. And if her albums are falling off faster than they usually are compared to her past, then that's telling us something about her consumption. It doesn't mean Beyonce is less talented. It doesn't mean her albums are worse. It doesn't mean her career is over. It means the way people consume her music now in 2026 is very different. And honestly, I think that's a much more interesting conversation than simply saying, oh, Beyonce fell off, because she clearly hasn't. Number 10, and I think this is the most important point and probably my biggest point, the Beyonce brand may actually be bigger than the music itself. Beyonce may have become so much bigger than her music that the music itself doesn't dominate her brand anymore. Like, think about everything surrounding Beyonce right now in 2026. You know, the fashion, the beauty, the culture, the performances, the tours, her family life, awards, visuals, Beyonce. It's Beyonce, right? The celebrity, the mythology of Beyonce. There's people that have churches named after Beyonce. There's a church of Beyonce. Like, the Beyonce brand is enormous, right?
We're going to come here to witness the Beyonce Mass, bringing together secular music and a religious message to tell a story of empowerment for particularly women of color, but for anyone who happens to sing praises to the goddess herself, Beyonce. Here we go.
Yo, I'm out of breath because we sing Beyonce in church. Holy cow.
Number 11, compare her with artists who constantly reactivate their catalogs. This is why the comparison with artists like Taylor Swift, Drake, and even some of the younger artists is so useful, because they're constantly giving listeners a reason to go back. You know, a new album makes people revisit the previous album, right? A tour brings an album back. A viral song resurrects an older track. Beyonce has historically been more selective. She creates that the mystique about her, the prestige about her. But prestige doesn't necessarily create streams. Daily streams, weekly streams, monthly streams, quarterly streams, yearly streams, right? And that's the uncomfortable reality of the streaming era. You can be one of the most respected artists alive and still lose the Billboard 200 battle to somebody with a much more aggressive catalog strategy. So I think the biggest takeaway here, if you ask me, is, you know, what the real reason is that why Beyonce doesn't have the same Billboard 200 presence as some of her peers. I don't think there's necessarily one answer, clearly, right? I basically gave you 10 plus reasons why that might be the case. I think it's a combination, you know, the long gaps between her releases, less constant catalog promotion, you know, less aggressive repackaging of her music, repackaging of bundles, or, you know, any product that she might have to roll out any of her albums. It just gives fewer reasons for casual listeners to revisit her entire album, right? A strategy built around major cultural events instead of constant visibility isn't going to really help your case on the Billboard, especially the Billboard. And, you know, most importantly, a catalog that doesn't always generate the same level of everyday streaming consumption that some of her peer catalogs do. I think that's the difference between being a superstar and being a superstar whose catalog is constantly being consumed. And Billboard measures the second one, honestly. So at the end of the day, I think, you know, I don't think Beyonce necessarily needs to change any of this, because Beyonce, in my opinion, she has mastered the art of making an album feel important. But what she hasn't mastered to that same degree is keeping that album commercially alive for years after the initial moment. And, you know, I think that's why this Billboard 200 situation is so fascinating to me. And that's why I wanted to make a video on it, because it's very, very weird seeing a Beyonce album not be on the Billboard 200. It's crazy, because the question isn't, is Beyonce still successful? Because she obviously is. The better question is, why doesn't Beyonce's massive cultural impact translate into the same kind of album longevity we're seeing from her peers? I think that's the real conversation, right? So let me know what y'all think in the comments down below. I'm responding to all comments, good comments, bad comments, terrible comments, whatever the case may be, because the engagement is everything, all right? It's your boy Word, who liked the video, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm out.